We explore the most dangerous and contaminated sites in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. The area around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, including the cooling pond, has been declared a restricted area because of high levels of radiation. The area is heavily guarded, and access is strictly controlled. The Chernobyl cooling pond, measuring around 22 hectares, was built in the early 1980s. It is fed by the Pripyat River. The water in the cooling pond was used to cool the reactors at the power plant, and then discharged back into the Pripyat River. This large artificial water body is located near the site of the Chernobyl disaster in Ukraine. The cooling pond was used to cool the power plant reactors, but after the disaster it became contaminated with radioactive material. Mutant giant catfish live in a special channel of the cooling pond. It is believed that the catfish have grown to an unusually large size in the contaminated water due to a lack of natural predators. The abundance of small fish and other aquatic organisms in the radioactive waters of the cooling pond contributed to the rapid growth of the giant catfish. Nuclear plant personnel refer to the pond as the Chernobyl Dolphinarium. Huge fish swim to the railway bridge in the hope of being treated to bread. The station staff are happy to bring the leftover bread, and are more than happy to feed the catfish. There used to be a huge 2-meter-long catfish living in this canal, which has become a local legend. Under the surface of the water you could see a huge shadow of a catfish slowly swimming in the radioactive water. The catfish was very fond of bread. He could swallow a whole loaf of bread at a time. As a rule, to a tossed piece of bread, the giant catfish swam leisurely and discreetly. Then it would dive to depth, and leisurely rise vertically up out of the darkness to the surface of the body of water. All those who watched the action held their breath, and became enthralled. After a few seconds, the open mouth of a fish emerged smoothly from the murky, radioactive water. It looked like the flaps of a suitcase. In a second, the catfish's huge mustached lips closed silently over the bread floating on the surface of the water. The audience watching shrieked noisily and approvingly, trying to hide their delight at what they were seeing. But, despite its Chernobyl star status, the giant catfish's fate did not turn out well. A tourist caught the gullible catfish on a homemade electrode hook. He killed the catfish and dragged the 2-meter-long body of the fish to the concrete bank of the canal. The catfish was killed for fun because the fish from the Chernobyl cooling pond is not fit for consumption. The content of radionuclides in the meat and bones of the fish is so high that it is comparable to radioactive waste. A half-meter-long catfish head, with a steel electrode hook sticking out of its mouth, was still lying under the bridge for weeks, attracting crows and scaring off Chernobyl tourists. After the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, the cooling pond was heavily contaminated with radioactive material, including cesium-137 and strontium-90. The contamination of the cooling pond made it very dangerous, and the surrounding area was declared a restricted area. The pond remains one of the most contaminated bodies of water in the world, and it will take many more years to clean it up. On an artificial island, between the cooling pond and the diversion channel, there is an abandoned secret laboratory. Here, after the Chernobyl accident, scientists studied the effects of high and low doses of radiation on animal organisms. The laboratory is located on the grounds of the Chernobyl nuclear plant, practically by the walls of the nuclear units of Stage 3, near the cooling pond. For a long time this place was classified. Before the accident, it was an ordinary fish farm consisting of 2 buildings, a laboratory, and a hatchery. Different species of fish were bred here. After the Chernobyl accident, a scientific experimental farm of radiology and recultivation was set up here. Scientists studied the effects of transuranic radionuclides on organisms of different animals that were bred here. In this abandoned laboratory on the cooling pond are the remains of research that scientists conducted here. They were assessing the radionuclide contamination of fish that lived in these ponds. Here we see test tubes with tissue samples from different fish species. There are also the fry that were grown in this laboratory. All these samples have been kept here for a long time. All this is evidence of the presence of science in the Chernobyl zone. This scientific base was located almost under the walls of the emergency station in a very contaminated area with very high radiation levels. Over time, there were rumors, and even scary legends about the creepy mutants of Chernobyl. In the abandoned laboratory, traces of the scientists' experiments and research are still preserved. There are jars and test tubes with fish samples scattered around in the room. But over time, scientific research declined, and the base closed in 2008. Today, in the dusty and radioactive abandoned buildings of the hatchery, waste drains and flasks lie lying around. On the concrete floor, lying in the dust, are elongated cone-shaped vessels in which the fry were reared. The accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant forced people to flee their homes, villages, and towns. Industrial plants came to a halt. Individual houses and entire settlements were destroyed and buried. The whole area around the nuclear power plant was contaminated by radiation. But, 35 years later, the nature of the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone is striking in its abundance of plants and animals. Today, the nature of the Chernobyl zone has recovered. A natural nature reserve has sprung up here. And for scientists, it is a unique scientific ground for studying the impact of radiation on living organisms and assessing the consequences of major environmental impacts.